Welcome, everybody. If you are just over on our True Restoration live stream, we are still the same three people. I'm Stephen Hyder, and with me is Frankie Logue and Matt Gaskin. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
I managed to do a costume change because we're going to start our discussion by where were you on Brexit Day? And I don't have that shirt with me. It's in a different location, but I was wearing an Arsenal shirt as I went down to College Green with Matt Gaskin to celebrate. But I want to pause for a minute and go to much younger Frankie Logue. I chuckled a little bit in our last stream when Frankie said, "When I was younger." Um, Frankie, tell us about the experience of Brexit for you. Let's just start on the day of. We're going to work backwards to what we were doing before, but just day of Brexit. Walk me through the emotions. What were you? Where were you? What were you doing?
So I was 13 when Brexit happened, or the vote happened, rather. And I remember, I ardently wanted this, and we'll talk about that more later. But I woke up and I was over the moon, and I went to school, and everyone was upset because we wouldn't be able to have Nando's anymore, they said. Because apparently it was a Portuguese company. It's actually South African. And a rumor had spread that we wouldn't be able to have, I think it was Cadbury's The Stars they do, let's not Milky Way, but something like that. We wouldn't be able to have them anymore because we couldn't trade with Europe. That's what they said. So I was loving it. Perhaps maybe more than you two. I was over the moon.
I do get. Listen, it would be an emergency for a 13-year-old not to have access to Nando's anymore. I get that. But I had a similar feeling. I was in London that day. I was a lot more politically engaged, and I'll talk about that later. But at that time in my life, I was a lot more politically engaged. I was in Scotland for the referendum. I know Frankie and I we differ on unionist ideas, but I was in Scotland for the referendum, and then I was in London for Brexit. But because of Project Fear, as we were calling it at the time, I wasn't sure what was going to happen. But when it happened, I called Matt and I said, "Is it Christmas morning? Is this what Christmas morning feels like?" I was over the moon. I was over the moon, and I thought, I can't believe it, because here's the narrative incoming. We won. And that was the dangerous idea. And in my Arsenal t-shirt, I met Matt near Westminster, and we walked to College Green, where there was all the BBC. Everyone had everything set up. We go and meet a UKIP guy who I recognized. That at that time I was watching UKIP videos like every day, posting them all over social media. I was very active for Leave as a non-citizen. I know that's hilarious, but I felt like people needed help pushing over the line. And Matt and I met a UKIP MEP, maybe it was an MEP. Then we met Dan Hannan, and we met Jacob Rees-Mogg. Before we found out that Jacob Rees-Mogg has no ability, he has no spine whatsoever. Before we found out that he was a jellyfish, we were just posing, getting our pictures with them, and I was euphoric. And there's a very famous inside joke. I'll let Matt tell it about a lorry driver as we were standing there, just taking in the moment, just hearing the beep, like in total meltdown that this has happened, and watching the traffic pass, and this lone man was walking by with a giant EU flag, and then
the van driver pulls up, winds his window down, and shouts, "We're out, mate!"
which is the most British thing, right?
Yeah.
But we've said that to each other over and over the years. However, that was the high point of the Brexit experience. We had gotten what we said we wanted. We didn't realize we didn't have the minerals. We didn't have the leadership to get us to the promised land. All we did was activate a key. And in fact, it took a while even for the button to be pushed. And then it was pushed by complete losers, starting with a prime minister who was opposed to Brexit. What universe are we living in?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Anyway, Matt, we haven't said how you felt on Brexit Day.
Well, I was convinced that I remember 2016 pretty clearly, because I was living in a little town in Surrey, and I had a Facebook page back then, and I remember obviously Trump in America and Brexit in the UK. and I had made a comment on Facebook about a the journalist article. And she was in America, and she'd left the big city, and she'd gone into small town America, and she started talking to people because she wanted to know why people might consider voting for Trump over Hillary Clinton. And it was for all the reasons that you would expect somebody to vote for Trump over Hillary Clinton. And this person, being fair-minded, had said, "I would I'm beginning to understand why people would actually vote for him. Obviously he's still an evil orange fascist, but I do understand why people might be convinced to vote for him." And I had commented, I shared this article, and I commented, if I lived in America, I would probably be inclined to vote for Trump too. And the backlash I got from my, I wouldn't call them friends, but the people I knew in my nice, small, quaint Surrey town where I used to go to a fitness club, the people in the fitness club, the backlash I got from them, I can't believe you would say this. So I wrote a series of blog articles explaining exactly why I would vote for Trump over Hillary Clinton, and just pointing out a few facts that they didn't know. And a lot of people read those and thought, "Oh, I didn't know that," because it's because the BBC is not going to tell you these kinds of things. And then I wrote the same thing for Brexit. Now I've deleted all those blog articles. Now you can't find them; they're not online because it's just pointless. But I voted for Brexit because on principle, I believe smaller government is better than bigger government. I mean, that's obviously true to anybody who's going to really critically think about it and look at the examples of bigger government versus smaller government over time. So I had told people, all my friendship group knew exactly where I was coming from. And when I went to bed on the evening before, I was convinced we would not leave the EU. So when we woke up in the morning and we had left, obviously the first thing I heard from the BBC, they led with the headline, how the pound had collapsed against the dollar and all the rest, doom was impending. But obviously I was very happy because in principle, I thought it was the right thing to do. And if I was presented with the same argument again, by the way, I would vote in exactly the same way because I'm voting on principles, not on whether I believe that the creatures that were actually charged with carrying this task out in Westminster actually have the ability and the will to do what is meant to be done. Obviously, people like Cameron and Clegg, Clegg, that was a coalition, wasn't it? And Osborne and the other, I think I'm giving them a compliment they don't deserve by calling them people. The other people in Westminster who were charged with doing this stuff, obviously they had no intention of doing it, and so we are left in the position that we're in now. But in principle, it was the right thing to do, and I would still vote the right way, even though I know that we have people in charge who are completely incapable of delivering what's required.
So Matt was writing blog articles. Frankie, what were you doing? And did people know your position at school?
Yeah, so the way I was involved in politics before I became involved in religion and began reading about Catholicism. And that happened when I was 11, I think, when the 2014 European Parliament elections happened and UKIP won them. And I saw the news. I thought, who's that? And I began reading and reading and reading.
11 years old, Frankie. Goodness.
Yeah, I know. Enticed by the big bad purple men at the age of 11. But then by the time 2015 rolled around and I started secondary school, my school ran a mock general election and I gave a speech for UKIP at that election.
Wow.
When I was 12. So everyone else there were in the sixth form. So they were aged 16 to 18. They were standing for Labour and so on. I know the person still who stood for the Conservatives. He's a very, very nice man. But so I gave a speech for UKIP and it was very daunting. You're speaking to over 1,000 young people. You mentioned shock horror immigration. So for me, it was like Matt. I wanted a smaller government, and for me, I also supported a lot of other things that UKIP supported on immigration and fiscal responsibility and things like that. And although I was too young to vote, I was in the Brexit referendum. I was telling everyone to go around to vote. because I just believed that our membership of the European Union was not what we were sold. We were sold on free trade, and even then the EU was quite protectionist outside the bloc, but also on parliamentary sovereignty. I don't think when it comes to Britain and how we have governed ourselves for a millennium, we've governed ourselves on the principle of precedent and parliament, including the Crown, House of Commons, and the House of Lords. Now, the balance between those three parts of parliament has often changed, not for the best over many centuries. But we never signed up for an extraterritorial parliament that would be able to supersede the will of our parliament. And I didn't believe that the British people wanted that. I didn't think we were asked. And when we were asked, we voted to come out, thankfully. And I would vote the same way again. Touching briefly on Osborne and Cameron, George Osborne and Ed Balls, who was the Shadow Chancellor for a time, they do a podcast together called Political Currency.
They do?
They do,
I didn't
yeah.
know that.
Oh.
No, it's occasionally I like to give it a listen, because sometimes you like to know how they think. What was their reason? And George Osborne said that he and David Cameron were always planning to step down if they lost the referendum, but couldn't say it publicly. So they lied to the public because they didn't want it to influence the vote. But they knew they were always going to stand down, which is totally.
They didn't want to incentivize them to vote leave.
No, James, that was part of it. But even though the Conservative Party has for many, many years now been occupied by people who belong in the Liberal Democrat Party and have no will or desire to see an independent Britain, no party can call itself conservative if it doesn't want an independent Britain who can raise its own taxes and have its own VAT policy and its own immigration policy. So even in spite of all of that, I, like you, Matt, would vote still for Brexit on a matter of principle.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't able to vote for Brexit, but as I say, as a foreigner, I was campaigning for it on principle. And this goes back to my experience of being raised in Singapore and on a small island in which government was efficient. I've lived in Switzerland where government is efficient. I've spent a lot of time in the Netherlands where government is efficient. So when you have a smaller body of land and you have cultural cohesion, you can make moves that make sense for the population. And you can do that. You can run an efficient government. So I've always been for that. That's part of why I was for Scottish independence as well. It is a novelty in British history for the nations to be united. They've been separate nations much longer than they've been a part of a united entity. And I wanted that to go back, not because I love the EU project or even the creatures who would run Scottish independence, but on principle, I wanted it. Not because I thought it would necessarily be in accord with my values. So this was, I say, my last political act, insofar as it was so disappointing. And I didn't realize, I was in denial for probably 2 years as to what was happening. I thought, okay, well, this is a shock to the system. The English will figure it out. And then you think, oh, Boris is coming in. Oh, it's really going to happen now. And the number of times I had to hear people like Theresa May, one of the worst prime ministers in English history, say Brexit means Brexit and that she's a tough lady. I mean, this fraud, total fraud. And all of these creatures are all frauds. And so I still lived in a universe. This was the end of my political. I had already been disabused of this. A little bit of story time. Back in the early, either late 90s, early 2000s, when there was a recall election in California, and I was a resident, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected. I was one of the votes that elected Arnold Schwarzenegger. Confessions, right? And part of that was he presented himself as an outsider. We would bring brooms to the rallies because he said he was going to sweep out Sacramento. And we totally believed it. It was like, he's an actor. He doesn't know anything. He was married to a Kennedy, right? So I didn't pick up on that. I'm some dummy. And I say, we're going to sweep it out. And he turns out to be horrible, terrible in many ways. And that sort of soured me on that. I voted for the last time in a U.S. presidential election in the primaries in 2012 for Ron Paul. The Republican establishment totally turned on him. No way that he was a populist. He was crushed in the same way Bernie Sanders was crushed by the Democrats, we cannot allow other voices. There's only one voice, and that is effectively the same voice. One wears a red shirt and one wears a blue shirt. Does that sound familiar, Frankie and Matt? I know it has nothing to do with football, and politics is much, much more important than that. But that was the end of my political action in America, the Schwarzenegger election, and then the 2012 election with Ron Paul. But then I thought, okay, well, maybe there's hope in England. And maybe, I mean, the Europeans seem to be pushing back. I had been following Nigel Farage since the very, very early days. In fact, I still am curious about the man working on this book. He's quite a character. But I thought, okay, well, maybe something can change in Europe. It's a smaller scale. And I was for this. And then just the slow motion disappointment. So I would say it was about 2 years. How long was it before it hit you all that Brexit was either not going to happen or it was going to be totally mitigated so as to not really be meaningfully an exit?
For me, it was the premiership of Boris Johnson. So one thing that has been delivered is that we now have control. We can choose how we govern ourselves officially, that is, as in Parliament can vote for whichever laws it wants, and a foreign parliament can't overrule them. But then Boris Johnson got that power and proceeded to use it to deliver the exact opposite of what many of the electorate were motivated by when they voted for Brexit. So many people were motivated by the prospect of controls on immigration, especially in the north of England and many places which felt neglected by the political establishment. So he kind of took that control back and then unleashed what they called the Boris wave on everyone. So that was point one, that he took what we did get back, which was control, which we have now, and then abused it. It's like raising a child and saying, okay, you can choose what you'd like to cook for dinner now. And then they cook the most unhealthy thing imaginable, and maybe one bite will kill them. And then also as well, it was the trade deal that was organized with the European Union. So as Stephen's alluded to, we differ on the question of the union. But I was not happy with the imposition of a sea border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. I felt that it undermined the union and ignored Northern Ireland. And I thought that whichever way one thinks of the issue, it's wrong to ignore them and to ignore small businesses in Northern Ireland. So for me, it wasn't so much that Brexit failed or didn't happen. It was that the powers which we gained from it were used in a manner that was contrary to the popular will of the electorate. And that disillusioned me with definitely the mainstream Conservative Party and a lot of British politics in general.
Yeah, for me, I think it was probably about the same period of time, Stephen, about 2 or 3 years. 2018, 2019. I mean, I was really getting ready to leave the country. I left in end of 2018. So I was not paying, I have to confess, I was paying an awful lot of attention to domestic politics because I knew I was leaving and going somewhere else. But it became very clear that nothing really was going to change because the people in power, and it's not really, and when I say that, I'm not even really talking about the MPs. I'm talking about the civil service. The civil service direct most of policy, and they will either facilitate or obstruct whatever they need to get what they want. Now, if you work in the civil service, you are almost by definition, not in all cases, of course, but almost by definition, pro-government, pro-big government, because the government provides you with a very, very comfortable workplace and a very, very comfortable pension. And it got to the point, even when I was still living in the country, that the average public sector pay was greater than the average private sector pay, which on its own is a ludicrous statistic if you think about it. So I got to the point a couple of years after I moved to the States, I realized that really nothing is going to change. And there's something actually tremendously liberating about realizing that really your votes don't really matter all that much. And if you want to be, and being completely disillusioned about any kind of politics, I would never spend the time that I spent writing those blog articles now, because it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't change anything. Nothing's going to happen. my opinion is really not that interested. I forget who it was who said it, but there's a famous axiom. If voting changed anything, it would be outlawed. And I feel like it speaks to, I've spoken about it before on these streams, why I will not take US citizenship. But one of the main pushbacks to that is, well, you could vote. That is not a selling point for me. I couldn't care less. Oh, I voted for Brexit. I didn't get it. So some people would say, well, that's a defeatist attitude, and you should be more strident in your views and all the rest of it. Okay, well, we'll see where that gets me. So that's my position on it. Probably about the same length of time. But as I said, I was kind of fixed on other things at the time, so I wasn't paying as close attention to it.
Yeah, Didymus is addressing a couple of the points you made here. Nothing disabused us of naivete like getting suckered on such a scale.
Yeah.
And moving beyond establishment politics into radicalism is definitely liberating. I suppose radicalism in the rad-trad sense, obviously, not in the traditional radical sense. But
Yeah.
I suppose that there's an opening there. We should have known with what they did to the Irish, the whole Lisbon Treaty thing. Oh, you voted no? You're going to vote again. You're going to vote again until you get the result. But we are the keepers of democracy. We are the believers in that's why we remove candidates from political office in Romania, because we're for democracy. And that's why we punish Hungary for voting against actions on behalf of Ukraine, because we believe in democracy.
So right? we try to outlaw a political party in Germany because we're very democratic.
We're very democratic. And so this goes back to this idea of, why would I not believe them when they tell me when they show me what they believe? The words are saying we believe in democracy, as if democracy is so great anyway. We believe in democracy, but the actions are, let's undermine it in every way possible. We're the keepers of free speech. I'm going to arrest a grandma because she made a post on Facebook. Right? You are showing me what you believe. I don't pay attention to what you're saying. I follow your actions. And so I think, Matt, to your point about, I wouldn't write those Facebook posts now, I wouldn't write those blog posts. I think Didymus had brought this up in our previous stream on True Restoration. How do we not fall into a black pill idea? Because the idea shouldn't be, well, you should be engaged. There is a limited amount of time I have in my day. I'm not possessed of infinite time. So are you suggesting, and that's what I would always push back, these people say you need to be more engaged. Are you suggesting that I should allot a certain amount of my day to writing petitions, to writing my congressman, to going around holding signs, to going to rallies, to putting on red hats? Is that what you think is going to make a substantial change for me, my community, my family, my country? So where is the balance between black pill, doomerism, because that's not Catholic, right? The black pill is not a Catholic response. And doing all the above, I would say the TFP response, which is writing petitions, going to protests, abortion clinic rallies. What's your take? And then Frankie, I'd like to hear your take.
Well, for me, I wouldn't write that stuff now because I have a family. My duty is primarily to my family before it's to anywhere else. Did my look at it this way? Did me writing those blog posts change anybody's view or persuade them one way or the other to vote for Brexit? I can think of maybe 2 people who might have persuaded them to vote for Brexit. Okay, so they voted for it. Great. Did it change anything? No, it didn't. So if I were to spend hours writing those things now to get 2 votes, it didn't change anything, rather than spending that time devoted either to my business, which provides my family, or spent time with my family, which do you think would be the better thing for me to do, and what will I be judged on at my particular judgment in how I've used that time? A political agenda that really led nowhere, or spending the time with my family as I am obliged to do. Yeah, not only do I enjoy doing it, but I'm obliged to do it by my state in life. I think the answer is pretty clear, and that is your answer. That's why I would not do that now, Frankie.
Yeah, no, I think that that's certainly right. I was much more belligerent about these things in secondary school. I like to have. There's always the trope about the conservative boy and the radical girl. They argue. So I similarly did not convert anyone to my way of thinking. And nowadays I've calmed down, you might say. I'm more
No longer
agreeable,
the
but in that
radical
way-
13-year-old.
my ever since I became Catholic, my beliefs haven't changed, but I put them across in a more agreeable way. And in that way, I've funny enough managed to convince some other people of my way of thinking and the Catholic way of thinking. I've just finished university, but in our Spanish classes every week we would debate some topic, and many of them touched on morality. But I often find that people on the left, their brains get triggered by something, by a word immediately. So you might say biology in a debate on transgenderism, and they might think immediately he's a bigot. So I found that if I couched my words, I could express, and without denying or obscuring any part of the truth, I could couch in such a way that they think, oh, maybe he's got a point. So in that aspect of writing articles and things like that, I think you're right. It's probably not the solution. But what I think is good, if we have the time, of course, is what you might broadly call community politics. And what do I mean by that? I mean making the place where we live a nice place to live. And obviously, the extent to which we can or should do that varies by our state in life. So if you don't have the time, you don't have the time. But in my case, I live in a student area of Leeds, a city in the north of England. And it's very busy and full of rubbish and graffiti and things like that. So I think that something which I can do and very easily often do is pick up rubbish and put it in the bin. And suddenly your street's a bit of a nicer place to live in. Or, for example, the main street next to where I live is full of shisha lounges, dessert shops, late night cafes. There are cars parked on the pavement and people can't get past. I've seen people on pushchairs have to go into the road.
Frankie, you keep using all this other language. I feel like I've got to put subtitles on for the Americans. When Frankie says pavement, he means sidewalk.
Yes.
And when he says push chairs, he means strollers. I'm sorry, my dear Americans who've never been back to the mother country. This is how these people talk.
Yeah, I didn't even know the stroller was a different word. So I've seen that happen. And recently, perhaps the third or fourth Indian restaurant to open up has opened up near me. And they're applying for planning permission to be able to be open and to serve alcohol until midnight. And I know that that's going to result in more cars parked on the pavement, more antisocial behavior, and generally it will be a worse place to live. Now, something very tangible and relatively easy, which I can do and did, was write an email to the local council objecting to it. And soon they'll have a meeting to discuss whether or not to give them permission. And I'll go to the meeting and I'll raise the objection in a polite, well-mannered way. Now, that's not the same as going to, the Conservative Party conference or the Reform UK conference or standing for Parliament, but it's something that's pretty easy to do. And hopefully it makes the street I live on a nicer place to live in. And it's not the national impact that, standing for Parliament will have, but I think that's much more reasonable and much more actionable.
Yeah, and you point out something interesting, Frankie, because I still believe, because of the scale of England, you can make a difference in your constituency.
Yeah.
You can vote your principles. It doesn't mean it's going to help, but that means that people in your constituency can say, I believe it. Let's God help you if this were ever to be the case. But I believe in my MP, Frankie, and what he stands for. And if you do give speeches, you can say, look, he's protesting against war crimes. He's protesting against supplying of weapons to a rogue terrorist state in the Middle East, which shall be unnamed. And we want to act against that. And because England's a small country. And so you're able to make these changes because was it Chesterton that says you want to keep your politicians close enough to kick them? So that idea is, I think, resonant. Whereas in America, this enormous country with this enormous populations, you're talking about many, many people that would report to a representative. And even then, almost all our representatives are bought and paid for. Not to say that they aren't in England. The lobby works on both sides of the Atlantic. But I feel there's more accountability. So I applaud that. I do think that you would probably still be denounced as racist when you go make your polite comment about the fourth Indian restaurant. Because as you know, that just shows how you're not diverse and that you don't realize that diversity is our strength. Frankie, Indian food is indigenous to England. Everybody knows this because we eat more curries in London than anywhere else. Therefore, it's indigenous. But you make a great point. Being, pick up the trash on your street, as it's referred to in England, rubbish. Put it in the trash can, also known as the bin. These are things that reflect on you. In fact, Frankie, I would go so far as to say, if you walk past trash and you don't pick it up, you're trash in a certain way. But that's because I grew up in Singapore where littering was like a $500 fine, right? So it's been very much ingrained in me that littering speaks about you as a people.
Yeah.
That if you don't care about your society, this is what you have.
Yeah.
And when I travel around the world and I see trash in capital cities lining the streets, I just think about how radically differently those people see themselves and how they represent, how do they show up and what that looks like. And I feel there's such a big gap in many ways. But now we're talking about, potentially the idea of there being superior cultures. And we know that's not this. And I think when you were giving those speeches, Frankie, you might have a t-shirt that just says, I am a bigot. I don't believe in the science. All those things, you could just prep them for it. You just start saying, just let me get this out of the way ahead of time. I'm a bigot who doesn't trust the science. And I don't believe that diversity is our strength. And then may I make my remarks now? And then, watch them. They're melting, in their outrage. So pointing to the future, I think, Frankie, you're on the verge of getting married and God willing, starting a family. Matt is already on that journey. When you are going to be, I don't necessarily say you're going to put him on your knee. I'm going to tell you about this time that we voted for Brexit, my dear son. I think more the question is, how did Brexit change the way that you look at politics, and how will it affect the way that you talk to your children about politics?
I think for me, a big part of Brexit, which I'm still glad happened, was that it was a punch in the teeth to the establishment. They were so shocked that people outside the M25, the motorway surrounding Greater London, could have thought differently to what they thought at the Islington dinner parties. And in that way, I'm glad that it happened. But that being said, like Matt and you mentioned earlier, the will or intent of politicians is often very different to what they say they're going to do. And although it's a tired line repeated by many, it's still very true that politicians lie all the time and they are all the same. So that's something it's taught me. Although I'm still happy to give the establishment a kick in the teeth through the ballot box whenever I have that kind of opportunity, I'll do it. But it definitely taught me that the best way to move forward is to, well, like you alluded to, Stephen, have a Singapore on my street, at least, if I can't have it across the country.
Are you asking that as a question?
No, I'm saying, sorry, that's what it's made me think. The experience of Brexit has taught me that, even if I can't have exactly what I would like in the national sphere, I can be like Lee Kuan Yew, have the iron in me and have a nice clean street at least. And as it pertains to the national sphere, I would have less hope.
Matt?
So Ila Belloc ran and was successfully elected in Manchester, and he was giving a public speech, and one of the men in the crowd knew he was Catholic. He said, "Hey, you're not one of those Catholics, are you?" He put his rosary out of his pocket, and he said, "Sir, this is my rosary. I pray these beads every day. If that offends you, please save me the indignity of representing you in Parliament." Because he had the idea that if you're elected to Parliament, you actually have to represent the ideas of the people that you represent. Brexit, for me, totally cured me of any idea that that's what politicians do. They don't represent the people that they are elected. I don't know what happens. I don't know if there's some, secret meeting they go into when they get into Parliament. They can talk about, all those constituents of yours. Forget them now, because this is the way that we need you to vote. The idea that we have a whip system in the UK is absurd. And if you don't know what that is, it means that the party whips are either elected MP, they don't have to be elected MPs, but they basically tell the politicians which way to vote on whichever bill goes through Parliament. So if you were, for example, some kind of, person who loved inflicting pain on yourself and you were a Catholic and you wanted to be an MP and you got elected, you would get sent to Parliament and the party whip will tell you which way to vote. And they use a 3-line whip. Well, the 1 line is you can kind of vote whichever way you want. 2 lines underlined in the bill is you need to vote this way. You kind of really need to vote this way. The government really wants your help on it. And 3-line is you don't vote the government's way. You're looking at getting replaced at the next election. And they will simply 3-line whip people and tell them which way to vote. So really, for Catholics, it's very difficult because if it's a moral case, if it's a case of morality where you cannot vote along party lines for whatever reason, you could be in hot water very quickly. So for me, really, the whole experience of 2016 taught me that don't attach yourself to any of the outcomes from politics, whether it's in the US or the UK or Australia, Canada or France or anywhere else. These people are, as Stephen alluded to earlier, bought and paid for, and they do not necessarily have your best interests at heart. Would I vote for Brexit again? Yeah, absolutely, in a heartbeat. Do I think Nigel Farage is going to do much good? No, probably not.
Yeah,
And unfortunately, because
add briefly.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Another member of Parliament from back in the day, another Birmingham man called Enoch Powell, said that Parliament is the mirror of the nation. And abstracting that and kind of applying a Catholic lens to that, I think we can say that modern society is rotten to its core, and Parliament, as a result, even abstracting from the organized forces of naturalism, is rotten to its core. So we get the politicians we deserve in many ways.
It's kind of amusing watching former liberals like Carl Benjamin coming around to the position that, perhaps Enoch Powell actually had a point.
I mean, how dare either of you quote that horrible racist who was absolutely correct about immigration? But we won't talk about that at the moment. I do have to point a corrective, Frankie, because this is my channel, and my listeners will know that I do not believe that Northern Ireland is a country. So Frankie made a reference to a place called Northern Ireland. No place can be properly called a country if it can be dissolved by a plebiscite in a treaty by the Irish people. So the fact that it could disappear tomorrow and the Crown and Parliament have nothing to say about it means that it's an occupational territory that goes back to the plantation of Ulster. So we are hoping one day that the occupation of Ireland will end. But for the moment, some people refer to it as Northern Ireland. And I just want to acknowledge what Frankie said earlier. He and I disagree on some points. That's okay. I'm happy to have a spirited debate on that some other time. But scripturally, nolite confidere in principibus, do not put your trust in princes. We have not here a lasting city. These are prompts from scripture, from our faith, that these things are not ultimately that important. So for people who do not have a supernatural outlook on life and who do not believe there's something after this, it is everything to them. And that's why they fight to the death for these issues. And that's why they're out there protesting and they put everything on the line. This is Nigel Farage's religion. I do not think, like his buddy President Trump, that he has no moral. I've said this about President Trump many times. He has no deeply held moral beliefs. I do not believe President Trump has any deeply held moral beliefs. Zero. I do think Farage has some, but they are moral beliefs like he believes in free speech or he believes in, that you must drink this many pints every time you go to a pub. Like, these are the deeply held beliefs of Nigel Farage, which in and of themselves are not the most horrible things. I mean, free speech is a pretty horrible thing, but I don't believe in him in a sense, because I think as I've come to read in this Michael Crick book and I've observed over the years, he is someone who has enjoyed playing the bomb thrower, even when he was a kid in school. But leadership, I don't know that he's ready for it. Same thing that with Jacob Rees-Mogg. He's perfectly happy to play the eccentric person who's never changed a nappy. But leadership, that's an entirely different thing altogether. And so when I think about this, we don't have to care in the way the world wants us to care, and the way that some trads would tell you you have a moral duty too. I do think, in a certain sense, you have a moral duty to what Frankie was talking about, taking care of what's around you and building, as Edmund Burke talked about, to quote another Irishman, our little platoons. That these are what will change the world. What did Pius IX said? Give me an army praying the rosary, and I will conquer the world. That Catholicism with subsidiarity, we are about bubbling up. And the globalist project is about a top-down forcing of their quote-unquote values. That's not how Catholicism works. That's not how the cathedrals got built. The cathedrals did not get built because of a mandate. It got built because a lot of people volunteered their time and it bubbled up. A lot of people contributed to make that happen. And so we can still adopt that Catholic attitude these days, which is do what you should do within your spheres, pick up the trash in your neighborhoods, write polite letters when cars are parking on the pavement, and show that example to your children. And that's the best that we can do. And after a while, we'll check out. And this will be someone else's problem. But it doesn't really have anything to do with the most important task in life, which is our eternal salvation. So do not allow people to talk you into taking it as seriously as that. It is important. It is not unimportant, but it's not really that serious at the end of the day. Any final thoughts before we wrap up, gentlemen?
No, I think you just about covered everything. Yeah.
Thank you for taking your time to join me, especially back-to-back streams. And we've long been wanting to talk about some of these things, so thank you for joining me. And if you're interested, you can find both Frankie and Matt on X. They are more or less somewhat active, one more so than the other. God bless. Thank you, Antonio. And you can engage with them there. And maybe if there's something that you want to see us talk about in the future, please feel free to add that to the comments after this stream, and we'll see if we can't pull that off. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.